we're going to talk about effective facilitation of team-based learning. And we're going to focus on how team-based learning, kind of the parameters of what team-based learning is, and then how we implement it at Creighton. And as Jessica said, I'm Mary Sinclair, and I am the Assistant Dean for Medical Education on the Omaha campus. And I'm also a member of the Department of Medical Education. So I'm going to start this, and then we're going to move to Leah Chrisman. If you want to introduce yourself.
Sure. Hi. Welcome, everybody. My name is Leah Chrisman. As you can see on the slide, I'm also in the Department of Medical Education. I'm an anatomist within that department, so I spend a lot of time down in the anatomy lab working with our PA and medical and master students. And starting in January, I'm going to direct the neuroscience block for the medical students. So I'm kind of all over the place, and I'm excited to help teach you a little bit today about our team-based learning here at Creighton and how we do that with the medical students in both the typical setup in the new Warner building or in the anatomy lab.
And I'm Cassandra Hayes. I'm also an assistant professor in the Department of Medical Education. I deliver physiology content to PAs and medical students. And I'm also the director of case-based learning. So I have quite a few observations about TBL facilitations that I'll share with you.
Right, so we'll get started, and I'm going to turn off my camera for fear that my presentation might freeze. So, there we go. So team-based learning, what is it? Team-based learning is really a systematic, flipped approach to teaching and learning that employs well-researched and documented teaching strategies. It is really active learning based on strengths of student collaboration and accountability, and it is the most prevalent active learning pedagogy in medical education around the world. Team-based learning is used in many medical schools in Europe, in Asia, in Africa, in the Middle East. So it is prevalent or a very common approach to teaching medical students. So the benefits of TBL: it is active learning, as I said, and it allows students to work with their peers. Students shift from being passive recipient of information to engaged discoverers in information. They learn from their peers. We know that near-peer teaching, near-peer learning is the most effective learning method for all students, not just medical students, rather than lecture-based or didactic-based education. For students, they collaboratively work together to apply concepts that they've learned. So while they're learning content, they're learning how to apply it at the same time. Team-based learning has a number of points where immediate feedback is available for the students. Also included is peer evaluation. For faculty, what team-based learning does is it provides a plan for flipping the classroom. Flipped classrooms, active learning, it's kind of hard to do without a really good plan for what you're going to do in the classroom, and this provides the plan. Students are accountable for preparation, so faculty don't need to wonder if they're prepared, if they've read the preparatory readings you gave them. There is a process, or built into team-based learning is accountability. Students can solve complex problems, and faculty can challenge the students in this way by asking more challenging questions. Team-based learning for faculty, it is much more fun than lecture. It provides lively, engaging dialogue, and it allows faculty to become facilitators of learning rather than transmitters of information. And essential elements. There are really 4 essential elements for team-based learning. One is that teams are properly formed, because these teams will work together for the long term. They're not just together for a week at a time or one session at a time. They're together in some instances for the entire pre-clerkship year. In other instances, they're together for a semester. But in any case, the students are expected to work together for the long term. Second essential element is the readiness assurance process, which consists of pre-work, and we'll talk more about pre-work in a bit, and an IRAT and TRAT. Again, more about that in a minute. The third essential element is having the students apply content information during the application exercises. And this is really the goal of team-based learning, is the application, having the students apply information. And finally, the fourth essential element is that the students are accountable at multiple points throughout the entire process to their own learning, but also to the learning of the team. So the 4 parts of a TBL session or a TBL activity includes preparatory work. And at Creighton, we use case-based learning and specific cases. Cassie mentioned the cases earlier, or explicit readings or other assignments. The case-based approach as pre-work is fairly unique in the team-based learning world. There is one other institution that uses cases as pre-work for TBLs right now, but the way we apply it is unique to Creighton. Then individual readiness assessment test is the second part, and this is where students come in and they take an individual test based on the pre-work. The students get a score for that, and once they're finished the individual readiness assessment test or the IRAT, then they move into their teams and take the same test again for the team readiness assessment test. Both of those are graded components of team-based learning. Finally, the 4S application exercises or the application exercises, these are 3 to 5 significant problems. The 4 S's stand for the problem. The exercises need to be significant. All student teams should be working on the same problem. The students should be asked to make, this team should be asked to make a specific choice. That means they have to make a decision on one potential answer and simultaneously report their answers. So the 4 S's, we use a digital platform where simultaneous reporting can be altered a little bit if we want, but those are the basic requirements for application exercises. Now, the TBL format at Creighton, I'm going to run through briefly because these TBL activities, whether they're associated with cases or are standalone, and Leah and Cassandra are going to talk about those. These are, the first component are individual preparation and contextual didactics. Team-based learning activities are contextualized within the content of the course block so that they don't occur on material that is completely anomalous within a particular part of a course block. The second part is the case-based learning. I'm going to focus on case-based learning. The cases, the students spend up to 2 hours on going over a case that is moderated. They work through page by page. These cases are in blue line, formatted in blue line, and that occurs on one day of the week. Usually takes, as I said, we usually assign about 120 minutes to the cases. Then the team-based learning part, readiness assurance. Students after the case are expected to review what they learned in the case in preparation for the team-based learning activities the next day. The next day, following the case, the students complete the IRAT, the individual readiness assurance test, and the team readiness assurance test. This enables individual discussion. They can continue to discuss concepts from the cases that were used to answer these questions. Mention appeals here. We're not going to talk about appeals, today, but that is the readiness assurance process, individual review, and the IRAT TRAT. Finally, the application of clinically integrated concepts and skills. I talked about the 4S application exercises. These, respectively, the readiness assurance portion of a team-based learning session, I have 20 to 30 minutes here. Typically, it's closer to 30 to 45 minutes for completion of the readiness assurance portion of the team-based learning activity. The remainder of a 2-hour period should be dedicated to the application of these concepts. The students work together in their teams to solve problems directly related to the pre-work, either the case or other pre-work. And as you can see, the way we have this formatted is that the students are moved from lower levels to higher levels of Bloom's taxonomy. They go from remembering to understanding as they begin to discuss in their teams, they begin to apply, working through the cases, then they analyze and ultimately evaluate and create. They're asked to evaluate and create when they are completing the application exercises. And the last thing I'm going to say, facilitating the team-based learning session. Some of the facilitation in team-based learning is very different than facilitation in other pedagogical practices. It's always the students and the student teams who should be doing the talking. Faculty should be the guides on the side rather than sages on stages. They're meant to be guides on the side. They're responsible. They can do this by listening actively to student teams, to student answers. They can prompt students to give responses and to challenge others' responses. They provide clarification, redirection of discussion if things get a little bit off track, and encourage students to provide evidence for the reasoning behind the answer that they gave. I've included in here a link to a TBL facilitation guide that should translate to the PDF that you'll receive from Jessica later. If it doesn't, if you're not able to access that, you can contact me or Cassandra or Leah, and we'll be able to help you with that. And the next slide, I'm not going to go through this, too many words, but you will have this available on your PowerPoint. This came directly, or on your PDF. This information comes directly from the facilitation and team-based learning instrument that was developed about 4 years ago. And this is what is expected of faculty who are facilitating team-based learning. So,
Okay.
yeah.
So I'm going to go through a little bit about preparing for TBL, kind of go a little bit further into depth about facilitating the TBL, like Mary talked about, and then compare that to what we see and what we do in the anatomy lab. So when preparing a TBL, the first and most important thing is to check your objectives by working and all of the pre-work content by working with clinical faculty that you're going to be having either facilitate these TBLs or facilitating them along with you, both here in the Omaha campus. And for example, with the medical school, we do a lot. We have to make sure everything is the same in the Phoenix campus. So in that case, you would want to have a meeting with the clinical faculty here in Omaha, as well as with the faculty that are presenting the TBLs in Phoenix to make sure everybody's on the same page. That's very important when it comes to determining what objectives you're going to be doing, if you're making any modifications to those objectives, as well as checking the pre-work content. So as Mary mentioned, we mostly are utilizing cases for the majority of the med curriculum. However, with the anatomy curriculum, we are using a lot of mini videos, mini lectures in a video format, so like about 10 to 15-minute videos. And some other places utilize articles, but either way, we're just wanting to make sure that all of that is consistent between campuses. And the really big important thing here is updating it each year. So making sure that the clinical faculty that are helping with this are giving you good feedback on if something's happening or something has changed in their clinical practice for standard of care from one year to the next. Fortunately, Cassandra does an awesome job of keeping track of that sort of stuff, and she'll go into that a little bit later. But then again, I know I've reiterated this a lot, but just making sure everybody's on the same page. Sometimes people get busy and aren't able to come to some of the meetings. And one of the big things is making sure that you don't have a situation where a faculty member is getting in front of the students and saying something's not great about a case or a TBL question. So making updates, then we're going to, after you've checked all the pre-work, you're then going to go through and review all of the questions. So those IRAT and TRAT questions, like Mary mentioned, you're going to make sure all of that is correct, that they're emphasizing the correct points from the updated pre-work. And then you're also going to go through and make sure that the application questions are questions that you truly want the students to emphasize and work on applying the content. So again, you want to make sure that there isn't a concept that you're emphasizing there that maybe isn't quite so correct anymore, and then getting the students a little off course. So that's a very important portion of our work, if you will, for the TBL. Next slide, please, Mary. Okay, so formatting. I know Mary already went through this, but this is an extremely wordy slide for those of you that like to not take notes, or if you just want to use this as a reference later. This is a full breakdown of what we do with the M1 and M2s for their TBLs. So we take the entire class and we divide it into groups of 8, or excuse me, teams of 8. When the students first come in, they will have an IRAT. And as Mary mentioned, this is an individual readiness assessment. So the students will have about 10 to 15 minutes to complete 5 multiple choice questions. As you can see on the slide, these are lower Bloom's taxonomy questions. And then once they're done with that, they will then go through those exact same 5 questions with their team. And that's going to be the TRAT questions. They'll have about 15 minutes to complete that. Then after their team is done answering those questions, we're going to discuss it as a big group. And this is really the important part, as Mary said, and where the important steps with a facilitator comes in is starting at this discussion point. And that's going to take about 20 minutes, and I'll go into that a little bit more in my next slide. After you're done with the discussion, then you'll go into the application questions. The application questions should be the remainder of the time. This should be about an hour, and it's going to be 3 to 5 open-ended questions. As you can see written on here, these are going to be the higher Bloom's taxonomy questions. They can either be multiple choice or they can be open-ended questions. But either way, there needs to be one best answer for there to be a good discussion with these questions and to satisfy our 4 S's. Next slide, please. Okay, so when facilitating the TBL, I mentioned just previously the importance of the discussion component. So this is really when the facilitating is coming into play. While the students are taking the IRAT and TRAT, you can watch the live feedback on how the students are responding by our Into Dashboard live feed. That's going to tell you how the students are responding. You can also circulate the classroom, listen to how the students are discussing. There's some written examples of you can sit down in the group and listen to them. I don't know if I would say I'm that bold to do something like that, but I suppose if it's your personality type or works with your group, then that's great. Once the students have completed all of the IRAT and TRAT and you're ready to go into the discussion phase, the first important portion is going to be paraphrasing that question that you want the students to answer. Then asking for a student volunteer. This can be done in different ways. You can either just simply ask somebody if they know the answer, or you can be creative and do some sort of random selection thing, app or whatever that picks a team number or picks a student. In the latter options, you run the risk of getting a student that maybe isn't super confident with their answer, and that's not a bad thing. What then your kind of next step is really going to be the facilitating component. So if you have a student that's not confident with their answer or kind of answers it with a question, then it's important to, as the facilitator, ask that question almost back to the class in a productive way. to allow the class to work together to give a collective answer. This is how we say that the facilitator doesn't need to be a content expert. This helps to reduce the chance or temptation, as it says on the slide, to get into a lecture situation, because if you have somebody that's maybe not a content expert, they're going to be better at facilitating and sending the question and asking the question back to the class. However, you do want to have an individual that's facilitating that can direct or clarify points if the students are getting stuck. So an anatomy example of this would be an IRAT-TRAT question that's asking a nerve that's innervating a particular muscle in the forearm. And the student says, I think it's this nerve. So then you can ask back to the class and they could say like, but I'm not really sure where it is in the forearm. So then the question as a facilitator back to the class would be, can somebody in the class please tell us the pathway of the nerve they selected? Let's just go with median nerve for this example. Can you trace the pathway of the median nerve through the forearm? And that allows the students to then go through the process of explaining the pathway of the nerve, as well as getting to the answer of the question, which is what nerve innervated that particular muscle. So you don't necessarily need a content expert, but you're going to need somebody that can correctly answer the question if you're facilitating and probing the students with additional questions. Next slide, please. Finally, how this compares, how that sort of standard format I just explained compares to what we do in the anatomy TBL sessions is only slightly different in that the classic TBL session for the M1s and M2s is a full 2 hours long, but the TBL sessions prior to going into the anatomy lab is only a 1 hour session. The reason we're able to do simply a 1 hour session is because after that 1 hour discussion, we're going to apply that content for another 3 hours in a dissection lab. So that's kind of part one, how we can get away with it only being 1 hour long. But before we get into that a little bit more, the breakdown in time that we utilize for an only 1 hour session is that we have pre-work assigned to the students. We have a series 2, 3, 10 to 15 minute videos that the anatomy faculty have put together on the region. There might also be some textbook and dissection guide readings associated. We then ask the students in the same format. You can see this image on the right-hand side of the screen is the image that we put up right at the beginning of a TBL session for anatomy. You can see that the IRAT, is going to take about 10 minutes, 10 to 15 minutes. The TRAT will then take another 10 to 15 minutes. We'll discuss for 15 minutes, and then we'll use the remainder of the time for the application questions. Our teams in the anatomy TBLs are smaller because we need smaller groups for our dissection standpoint. So we only have 6 students per group. How it also differs is that we're in a different room. So this is held in Riggy, which is a stadium seating format in comparison to the specialized tables that are utilized over in Warner. We still paraphrase the question, we still ask for student volunteers, and we still work to facilitate the discussion by asking questions back to the class to help the students engage and allow for a more engaging learning experience. So, Cassandra, I think you're up next.
Okay, so I sort of pared down all of the challenges of facilitation down to 3 that come from the literature and observations of our own students and their evaluations as well. And I'll share some of those with you. So it all boils down to 3 things. Number 1 is people have challenges, especially when they just walk in and think that they can facilitate something because they've been a seasoned educator for a number of years, and thinking that they can keep an environment for student engagement. So a good environment is one where it's collegial, students are engaged, and they're all held accountable for learning the material. Another one is keeping with objectives of the activity. A lot of seasoned educators expect this to be a time to deliver content, but when extra things are added on beyond the objectives, that tends to convolute some of the salient points that we're wanting students to get out of the activity. And lastly is keeping time. And this is pretty important because the students value efficiently, and they view it as a waste of time if things get repetitive. And that's really sad because they've invested a lot of time in doing this, in discussing the case, and then in sitting there. And so you do not have to fill the whole 2 hours. You just want to make sure that you've met the learning objectives. So we don't want anyone to feel like we've wasted their time, or they're not going to value the rest of their TBLs for the rest of medical school. All right, Mary. And all of these can be overcome by faculty preparation, which you're already doing right now. Both Mary and Leah kind of went over all of the things that will keep you from having these challenges. Okay, advance. So an ideal environment is one where students can share their opinions without fear of ridicule. So we need it to be, we need a faculty moderator to be very neutral. And this helps all of the students participate in finding the answer. Remember, it's not the role of the faculty to provide the answer, but they can then find the answer as a group. My screen just went black, but I think I can still do that. Okay, and then the other thing is that we need to keep students engaged and accountable. And so we need to be able to call on them. And it's important to remember, and this is another thing about creating a collegial and open environment, is that students, they take a while to sort of gather their thoughts and feel confident enough to articulate their opinion. And this is even after group discussion, they kind of work at getting the guts to do that in front of their entire medical school class and in front of their faculty, and that's hard. And so it really is important to give a chance and wait for a little bit. And silence makes me so uncomfortable, but it really, and it's like 10 seconds is excruciating, but you really should give them time. 30 seconds is fine before trying to call on someone. And we said that we want the students to be accountable. So we can call on people at random. You can call on tables, but even better is to be able to call on students by name. So it's helpful to either have a co-facilitator that knows the students, and that's also very comfortable for the students as well. They can call on them by name, or alternatively, you can use the wheel of names or the deck of cards, some strategies that Leah had just mentioned. And then you can advance, Mary. Did you do it? I can't see. Am I still on Zoom?
Yeah, you are.
Okay, I can't see anything. Okay, so these are some snippets from student evaluations where there was not a collegial environment provided. So students noted that one of the facilitators was rude when correcting students, or unprofessional and condescending, or a self-important attitude. And you can advance, I've got an animation. This can be fixed by just reminding facilitators that the purpose is for students to get to an answer. You don't, oh, it came back. You don't have to know things, and you don't have to correct students. You can have other students correct students, which is helpful, and it's more comfortable for students. And we have to maintain absolute neutrality. Even like oh, wow, that was a good answer, is not suggested for a TBL facilitator. So we want to maintain neutrality. And then obviously condescension makes students less likely to want to speak up, and you will have to call on them. And it also just makes the learning experience uncomfortable. And we want you're interested in things that you enjoy. So we want to avoid that. And that seems obvious, but just sort of be aware of the way that you react to things and how something might sound to a student who is, their knowledge is emerging, and we need to remember that, especially the M1s, even at the very beginning of the year, they are just learning, even about this process. The next one, oh yes, no, you can go forward, is keeping with the objectives for the activity. So there are times, and the most the biggest things are that if you remove your content expert hat and wear the facilitator hat for 99.9% of the TBL session, you'll be fine with this. You should have reviewed the case and or pre-work and then the questions as well. And just make sure that you don't go beyond those objectives. And if you don't find yourself lecturing, that should not be a problem. Like if we stick to where the questions lead and you stick to, just continuing discussions around those, it should be pretty easy to adhere with the objectives. When you add new information, that makes it hard for students to understand what to get out of it. And I think especially for the M1s and M2s, sometimes clinical faculty will offer a few pearls about, well, in this instance, you should do this and this. And it is helpful, but not for the level of learning of the M1s and M2s at that point. And also sometimes it disagrees with what has been cited in their case. And that happens. It has happened many times. And then that also sort of undermines the value that any students thought that they got from going through the pre-work with their groups. And the last big thing that happens all the time is that facilitators should not disagree with the validity of a question when they're in the room with students. And that is really hard. It's either a knee-jerk reaction to defend the question and, say why, and then you've become a content expert. I've done that. Or if a faculty says that there's something wrong with the question, that can be a problem. Again, that erodes trust in the activity. But hopefully any disagreements with the correct answers of questions have been addressed in a prior review with other faculty. And I do that with the M1 and M2 facilitators and block directors so that we can just update the case to modern clinical guidelines, as well as just make sure everybody's on the same page as to the right answers. Okay, advance. So there's a lot of them here, but you can read and listen. These are some examples of evaluations where people were frustrated with students kind of going off of the objectives. And the first is when they have described clinical management that's different than what they learned in the case. And we know that medicine is an art and there is room for difference there, but it's important that they have met the objectives, which are prescribed by the case. We really need to kind of have faculty be aware of that and stick to it. And you can advance. And the other thing is when people agree that or most students want things to be kept short and concise. And again, because if things are expanded by lecturing, too long and hard to tell what's going on. And then lastly, there's so many comments and evaluations about when people have a clinician up there, a practicing clinician, a world-renowned clinician, someone that's really, really great, that says that's a bad question. That happens on both campuses. And that's really frustrating for the students because especially if they get it right, because they've worked very hard up until that point. So my suggestion with this is don't say that. You can look for other opinions. And if there's still some disagreements, or if there's a student that is, saying that there's a question that they think is ambiguous or something like that, keep the discussion going, but you can advise them to use the appeals process. So students have an opportunity with their group to appeal a question, and they can make their argument in writing, and faculty will review it. And many times these appeals are rejected, and sometimes we're corrected because we're all human, and that's fine. But it keeps from that undermining of the trust in the activity that might happen if that occurs in the classroom. All right, advance. And the last thing is keeping time. I just checked my clock. And part of that is just kind of knowing how the TBL session goes, reviewing the questions ahead of time, reviewing them while you're in the room, looking at into dashboard, as Leah said, to kind of find out where you're going to need to take the discussion. Which which readiness assurance items didn't have, like, had 100% consensus amongst the class. You don't need to talk about that at all usually, unless this is like a huge point and you can just reiterate what they've said, making sure they got to the answer in the right way. But students don't expect to spend a lot of time on these readiness assurance items. They're lower Bloom's taxonomy. It's everything that's directly applied to the case. It's very directly related to the case. And if they didn't arrive there with their group, it should be pretty easy for them to be able to look that up. As opposed to an application question, which again is applying and might have a little bit more nuance. So we spend more time on the application question. So if you're someone that has been hurt for time in the past, then make sure that you're spending it on the application questions rather than the RAT questions. And try not to lecture, of course, and that kind of keeps timing to a minimum. All that extra time can be spent waiting while crickets chirp for students to answer. And then you should be prepared to interrupt or redirect a discussion. And again, you have to do this neutrally. But if there's a slight pause, you can say, you make a sound point. Let's have someone else answer on this, and just make sure that you're not going in circles. And then lastly is to make time for closure. I think this is really important. The literature has shown that some students leave these activities and they don't feel confident in having gotten the correct information from their peers. And so this is one bit where you can put on the content expert hat and sort of sum up the most salient points. Just remember that, we arrived at this answer because you said this, and that's really important. Those types of things, just a few minutes, and that gives students the confidence that they've gotten to the right answer by way of a content expert telling them that they did. All right, and then again, I said students, they sort of start to feel like it's a waste of their time, or they become disengaged when things become repetitive. And especially this happens when a lot of people have had a consensus agreement on the RAT items and still time is spent on them. And again, if you know that those RAT items should be easily answered, you won't spend time on that. And then next is to just kind of know where this case lies within the curriculum, and that you really should not have to lecture. And by now it's like, don't lecture, that, but you don't have to. A lot of this other stuff doesn't need to necessarily be reiterated from other lectures or other. This particular evaluation went on to say that they got lectured on things that were in the gold track that they learned in a completely different time. So just remember you're facilitating, and then that students do check out if things get too long and then they don't like TBLs. We want them to like it, darn it, because what you like is what you're interested in. And okay, lastly, yes, so having good and efficient discussion is way more important than filling the 2 hours. And I share these student evaluations, and I think most of the time everybody takes student evaluations with a grain of salt, and they it's a way for them to air their critiques. But for TBL facilitation in particular, I think it's super important to get the feelings of students, because their comfort with the activity, that's directly related to what they're going to get out of it and how they can participate with their classmates. All right, and then lastly, you might have noticed that all of these challenges that people have can just be overcome by preparing and knowing that you're not supposed to lecture, and knowing the questions ahead of time and editing them ahead of time, and getting in the habit of biting your tongue if you disagree with something. And also just knowing that you can direct students to appeals processes, etc. And okay, Mary, you can advance. I am happy to help anyone with any preparation that occurs for if you're a new facilitator. And if that happens, you'll also be, if you're facilitating for an M1 or M2 case TBL, then you'll be in a meeting with me and block directors and other faculty, and you'll kind of see where there were some pitfalls last year, and we'll have suggestions to fix them. All right, that's it. Look at me keeping time.
And Mary, if you will just advance one more slide, I think we have the CE credit in the chat, but then also, yes, right there. So we'll just leave that up for a couple minutes while we're discussing and asking questions. Thank you so much, Mary, Leah, and Cassie, for your information on TBLs. I do already have a question in the chat, and it's for facilitators. Would you ever have a facilitator encourage students to look outside of the case material that is provided to find answers?
Yes.
Always for application exercises.
Yeah. And I think this is especially when they've got a question that's adjacent to the material, like they've had something in the case and they've thought of something else and they want to come up after class and ask. And it's almost better to just direct them to a good resource than tell them something, because that's not part of what they're supposed to be leading class with. And then that also sends them on to learn by themselves, which is a good skill.
And one of the things we didn't mention was the IRAT and TRAT, because it comes directly from the pre-work. The questions come directly from, whether it's a case or a video or an article, come directly from the pre-work. So they are closed book. The application exercises are not graded, and those are open book, and they should be so complex that the students can't put the question into Google and come up with an answer. They need to pull things together. They need to be critical and analyze and solve the problem. So always they should be, as long as they know the correct resources. And that's what we try to do in the cases, is give them links to valid resources for finding information.
Yeah, and I would add too that in the case, that's why it's really important to have those nicely laid out objectives, because that helps the students focus on what they needed to get out of the case to prepare for the TBL the next morning. So then as a facilitator and as a student during the TBL session, you have those objectives that you're falling back on, and then you're using that for your application questions as well, which then allows them, like you said, to go outside the box.
Thank you for that. I do have another question, but Mary, I'll go ahead and let you stop sharing just so we can kind of see each other, and then people can unmute as well. But I will ask this other question that came through in the chat. I've heard students joking about trying to get out of TBL within 45 minutes. How do you differentiate between students that need the full 2 hours and they might be on a team with somebody who is comfortable with half an hour or 45 minutes and they feel confident?
Are you asking about the TBL or the TBL?
That would be the case more likely than the TBL.
That they're working together as a team. Because
Yes.
the whole class gets out at the same time with the TBL because you have somebody leading it, right? So maybe they're asking about the CBL and they're in their small group of 8 students, and some would like to spend a little more time than others.
I think that if we hold students accountable and call on not just random tables, but random students, and everybody, I hate to say threat because I just said we need this nice collegial environment, but there's a threat of being called on. I think that puts an onus on them to spend the time to prepare. And maybe they don't like to do it as a group, and I suppose that's fine, and they can look up those objectives on their own. But they might find that some of their classmates that went through the case are better prepared because those items come from the case. It really will help them.
That is so. This is something that we've been noticing on occasion with the CBLs, that you have somebody in the group that's maybe a faster reader or somebody that's understanding the content quicker than the rest of the group and is trying to drive the timeline for the case-based learning component, because that is completely independent. At the beginning of the first year, we have a facilitator sitting in there with them to help, but then by this point in the year, the students are doing that independently. And there has been situations where we have a student within a group that comes to us and says, you know, I'm always the person that's slowing down the group. It's making me feel really uncomfortable. And that's something that something that we have to battle frequently. And what we ask them to do is they have student evaluations. So we ask them to reflect that in their student evaluation. If it's not coming out there, for them to try to work together as a group to come to some sort of mutual understanding that makes everybody happy. Because like you said, and like the person that wrote the question, it is concerning because you're losing out on two components when you're doing this. When you have one student that's rushing through, they're losing out on the opportunity to truly understand the content as a whole group. And you're making the person that feels like they're slowing down the group feel less and less confident with the knowledge and with their ability to ask questions in a comfortable environment, which is that collegiate atmosphere that Cassandra keeps talking about. But again, now I'm talking about the CBL, not the TBL, but it's still the same concept. And we're hoping that the students during that CBL session, during the case, that they can work together and understand the content, and then we give them objectives at the end for them to focus their studies on the next morning. It is a challenge.
And Mary, yeah, right. And Mary did put in there as well, the peer evaluations are really designed to kind of help navigate the timing and how much effort they're putting into it. Thank you. Any other questions? You are welcome to unmute yourself and ask or put anything in the chat.